Well, it's Professor Buzzkill here, busting myths, taking names. We're doing something brand new on this show. We are talking about a textbook. Most of the time we talk to historians, we interview historians about their specialist studies that they've published. But with us today on the line is Professor Steve Hahn from New York University, who's just recently published what I think is the most innovative textbook for American college courses on U.S. history. It's called Forging America, A Continental History of the United States. Dr. Hahn, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
I'm so interested in this book, and it's the book I'm going to assign starting next semester from now on.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Because of this partly because of this continental geographic approach and the new way you want to present this to, in theory, high school students, but especially to college students. It's something that looks at not just the history of the United States, but really the history of the North American continent, and then how that history impacts the eventual history of the United States. Is that a fair characterization of the book and the
I
project?
think that's a fair characterization, yes.
Why did you choose that sort of geographic/continental approach?
Well, for a number of reasons. One is that I thought that an Euro-Atlantic approach, which was pretty much where most of textbook thinking and overall histories of the U.S. tend to focus, at least early on, they kind of move from the East to the West. But in doing other research for myself and work I was doing, there were a few things that were really important. One is that it was clear that right from the beginning, American policymakers saw the West Coast and the Pacific as really the beacon of American destiny, that they imagined the United States being as what they would call an ocean-bound republic. And I thought the Pacific had really been under-discussed until pretty much late in the game. I was also interested in suggesting that history is not linear. And the reason for that is the book starts and ends in China. And it starts in Ming China, when China was really the major global empire, which goes into decline. And then it ends with China rising anew as, at the very least, one of the two major powers in the world. And it's a way of saying that, historical change does not necessarily move along a straight line. And there's no way of easily predicting what'll happen in the long run. So I also wanted to keep open the idea that the whole continent of North America was being contested, and that the map that we kind of visualize on the continent as almost destined to be so was not the case at all. And I thought we would have a better idea of the forces at work and the possibilities that may have been available by thinking continentally rather than thinking about simply the emergence of a union, then a nation state. I was interested in native peoples, their constellations of power across the continent, their trade networks that unfolded, how to think about that in relationship to American development, then how to think about both Canada and Mexico as really important players in the game. We all think globally much more than was true in the past. And the book is globally oriented without question, but I thought it would be more manageable rather than think about global America, to think about a continental history, which can do both.
Yes, we often are taught, and we have been taught for the rise of professional history is a mid-19th century phenomenon, late 19th century phenomenon, and there's, as you say, the trope of starting in the East and moving westward, a sort of carpet of civilization unrolling across the
Right.
continent. And in reality, there are people that have been there for a couple of millennia.
Mm-hmm.
They're at least as important to the development of what becomes the United States as the people who land on Plymouth Rock, or at least in the old legend. By the way, in the very beginning of the book, I was interested. I think most people know about the migration of people from Northeast Asia over the famous land bridge and then down. But I was interested to find out that there was also a great deal of seaborne navigation,
right,
following the same sort of arc into the
right.
West.
They called it the Kelp Highway.
Yes, now why is that? Why was it called the Kelp Highway, and why did it develop the way it did and become such a population conduit?
Well, I think in part, this has been the product of archaeological investigations and understandings of the changing environment and ecology of North America, and a recognition that at the time that the movement, the migrations from Northeast Asia to North America and then eventually further south, is that along the coast that there was a much more abundant plant life, and therefore it enabled seaborne people to kind of hug the coast. They didn't have to go out across the Pacific Ocean. They could follow the coast all the way down, which put them not only close to land, but in fact gave them the opportunity to also land and take flora, fauna, animals, vegetation, edible things. I think that this is becoming pretty widely agreed upon. And it does give us a sense of the different routes that migrants took and some sense of how they were able to move as far south as they did, because it didn't take all that long before migrants were eventually at the southern tip of what we now call South America.
So, in one way, certainly in this early part, it isn't an east west thing, it's a west east thing because
Yeah,
as the
exactly.
people land and then populate, that's going to be an amazing revelation to a lot of, if you will, traditionalists.
Well, one of the things I was interested in, since in part because I taught in California for a long time, was in recognizing that the history of what becomes the United States does have this west to east movement. I mean, there's always been this sense that we move from east to west, the Trans-Mississippi West is this kind of strange place out there. And if you think about it the other way, and especially the complex and very substantial civilizations that emerge and that themselves went through many changes over time. I mean, that's another thing we have to recognize, is that we don't know very much, but one of the things we do know is that indigenous peoples all over the place transformed themselves, in part because the climate also changed and the possibility of, for example, sedentary agriculture emerged at certain points. And so we can also think about what was happening in the Southwest in relationship to what was happening in what we would call Mexico and Central America. We didn't see the emergence of the kind of densely populated civilizations that were true further south, but some of the things were happening at the same time.
But we do see mound building societies
Yes.
in Illinois and
Yes,
in other parts of the Midwest. This is an astounding thing
it really
to
is.
track.
There's an urban aspect to this, and also obviously a sacred aspect to this, which
Hmm.
also I think is important to recognize that this sort of thing was happening all over the world at the same time. I mean, this is true in Europe,
Hmm.
continental Europe, as well as in the interior of North America. And most of these large scale population centers were built around what were regarded as sacred sites, which was true most everywhere. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, is that there is all sorts of interesting similarities and eventually interconnections that are part of the story of what becomes the United States.
And then, of course, once Europeans and people from the Atlantic world start to arrive, so to speak, they arrive really in the Caribbean and then move from south to north.
Right. Obviously, their arrival in first Roanoke and then Virginia is around the same time that they began to arrive in the Caribbean. But you make a good point, which is in terms of colonialism and the development of these territories, the Caribbean is much, much more consequential to the British, to the French, to the Spanish than North America ever is,
Hmm.
because of the incredibly valuable plantation crops that are grown there. But as you say, we have a very large frame of interaction that is really hemispheric. And that's important for us to recognize too. So that is about, what if we look from the Caribbean north, as well as from the north toward the Caribbean? And in some ways, looking north from the Caribbean, just as looking south from the southern part of what becomes the United States, helps us understand the lead up to the War of the Rebellion in the 19th century. So
Hmm.
These kind of shifting perspectives are very valuable to thinking about, well, what is really important that's going on here?
Well, then, when people who we think of the pilgrims and the settlers in Virginia and in the Northeast, after they land, one might think that the most logical thing for them to do would be to hug to the notion of the Atlantic world. The Atlantic world, in theory, brought them there.
Yeah.
Their trading with England and trading with Europe will sustain them. Why then is there this almost immediate and then constantly from there on, I don't want to say obsession with the West, but always thinking about the West and the Western movement among these new peoples on the continent?
Well, that's a good question. And first thing I think is important to recognize is that indigenous people in North America had made contact with Europeans well before the settler colonialists showed up. And so, from their point of view, as well as from the European point of view, there was a sense of what was there. And certainly
Hmm.
from early on, there was trade was an extremely important interlink, not only between different indigenous peoples, but between indigenous peoples and the Europeans. One of the reasons is that population pressure began to move them in new territories, especially also land engrossment. In areas like Virginia, that as the tobacco economy took off in the 17th century, large estates began forming. It actually accelerates at the end of the 17th and into the 18th century. And as the population grew, and as the servant population of Europeans began to live long enough to serve out their terms of indentured servitude, they were looking for land, and there was no land along the coast, so they had to move to the west. Of course, this is part of a constant process of push and restraint that the British, once they take control of much of the continent after the 7 Years' War, are trying to keep colonists out of the Trans-Appalachian West. They have 1763, they mark a line that they don't, in part, they don't want to provoke warfare with indigenous people. There's a constant push, and I think it's a combination of land speculation, land engrossment, population growth, and also senses of knowledge of what was going on in different places that kind of become part of at least continental stage, as you may say, because for a long time, I think it's important to see the continent as a stage where there's a clash of all sort of different empires, of Spain and France and England, and of native people, some of whom, like the Comanche or Apache, are extremely formidable. They have their own tribute systems, own trading relations that are far-flung. And so part of it is to say, look, it's not entirely clear how things are going to end up. And one of the key changes that takes place is that France and Spain get basically bounced off North America. It opens the way for first the British and then the Americans, which is not good news for indigenous people.
One of the things that's so interesting is there is a strong conception, because it's an actual fact on the ground, that there are tons of indigenous people there. Why do we then get, by the 19th century, among the Euro Americans, this notion that the West is sort of this blank canvas that can then be just settled, and you can move out there without restraint or anything like that? After all, people in the 18th century don't necessarily think that. They realize that it's much more difficult. I'm not saying the 19th century people necessarily forgot about indigenous populations, but there seems to be sort of ideology imposed on top that says
Well, I
the
think
West
this
is
is
all
something that
ours.
happens later, actually. There are a number of aspects of the story. One, of course, is the dramatic population decline of indigenous people owing to disease. And if you combine that with military confrontations and then basically their expulsion from east of the Mississippi River. But as you know, you're saying, everybody knew about this. And in fact, during the Civil War, there's an explosion of Indian warfare all over the Trans-Mississippi West. And the project of trying to move west, even after California became part of the Union and the US-Mexican War was over, everyone recognized that it was going to require the military defeat and then isolation, put on reservations, of Native people. So I think what happens later on is a kind of reconfiguration of what the Trans-Mississippi West was like that people in the middle of the 19th century knew full well. They sometimes they looked at it as kind of an exotic location, and they recognized that the climate was different. They recognized that the geography and terrain overall was different. But it was widely understood that there were a lot of people out there, and they, in many cases, were recognized as obstacles and hurdles in the path of American progress. I think by the 20th century, especially as most Native people are on reservations, and most of them really were not interested in giving up their tribal identities to become U.S. citizens. Then there are fewer and fewer people out there, but even so, it's a much more populated area than sometimes we have in mind the idea of this vacant land out in the West, which is a way of justifying American expansion, which was really American conquest.
Right, but it isn't also the vacant land idea something that feeds into the larger notions of manifest destiny and the larger notions of liberty guiding the people across the West and things like that? You see this in a lot of popular culture at the time, paintings and prints and popular songs and things like
Yes,
that.
right.
Why do you think that cultural level of believing in an
Well, you
empty
raised the issue
West
about
was so
manifest
strong?
destiny, but even so, the idea of manifest destiny was both a justification for American territorial expansion and for American conquest. Manifest destiny was about Texas and what we call the Texas Revolution. It was about the U.S.-Mexican War. It was about the idea of the Southwest and, of course, a continental ocean-bound republic, a sense that whoever was there would benefit from contact with Americans, from contact with Christians, from contact with people who regarded themselves as being civilized. I mean, one of the logics, and the U.S.-Mexican War was very, very contentious and controversial politically from the beginning. But one of the things that helped attract, at least for a while, public support was the fact that they were fighting Catholics. And anti-Catholicism is such a powerful force in American history, really, from the outset well into the 20th century.
Well, if you don't mind, if we shift gears, I'd like to nerd out on a sort of professorial level. Our listeners know, because we always interview people who've written monographs, scholarly monographs, are extremely difficult to do and take
Yeah.
many, many years. But I sometimes think, and I thought even more when going through these two volumes, is that writing a textbook like this, planning and organizing a textbook like this, making sure that you're saying something new but also useful to all college students at a very essential, must be extremely difficult. First of all, just the sheer layout and the number of extra things you have to put in timelines
Right,
and maps.
exactly. Well, all I could say is if you knew then what you know at the end, not entirely clear what you would do, because as you say, it's not only about writing the text, which is by itself a really formidable undertaking, but it's about all the pedagogical apparatus that goes along with it. I hadn't thought about this. Some textbook company rang me up and asked if I'd be interested in writing a single author text. And at first I was about to say no. And then I thought, I was always interested in doing this kind of thing. And I was sort of finishing a book that covered a lot of the 19th century. And I thought, well, I could do this. It is both about doing things that are new and recognizing that most instructors don't really want things that are that new because they don't want to have to change their lectures, which I completely understand. Many of them are kind of by the seat of their pants to begin with. And so you have
Because
to
they're
try
usually
to find
overworked. Yeah.
way overwork and way underpaid. And most of them are very good at what they do. But I think you have to try to find a line between familiarity that instructors can incorporate into what they do with enough difference to make it attractive and appealing. One of the things I try to do is have this what if section at the end of every chapter, because I learned teaching survey courses that students were really fascinated by this. They hadn't imagined that there could be a different historical outcome. And however one wants to think about it, because he was very careful not to be silly with what ifs, but to think about what was possible on the ground, is that it also sharpens the kind of questions we ask about what did happen. And then to ask about, well, why was it the case that this what if didn't happen? Thinking continentally, for example, one of the what ifs is about the Haitian Revolution. Till the War of the Rebellion, that's the only successful slave rebellion in modern history. It
Hmm.
could easily have been defeated very quickly. And if it had been, Napoleon would have wanted to hold on to his continental empire. Saint-Domingue, which became Haiti, would have remained a incredibly prosperous plantation economy. And native people in the middle of the country would actually have had an ally, which they
Yes.
lost. So all of a sudden you think, well, look, this was an unusual event that a rebellion turned into a revolution and it succeeded, but it was more likely to have ended up in failure. And then what would it have looked like? Those are issues that I think are really worth thinking about, because one of the themes in the textbook is contingency, is that things are
Hmm.
not
Hmm.
preordained. Outcomes are not preordained. They're about politics. They're about chances. They're about unusual things. There are large forces that make certain outcomes more possible, more likely than others. There's no question about that. But on the other hand, it doesn't mean, even using the Haitian Revolution example, the French managed to hold on to what we call the Louisiana Territory for a long time. Then either the United States would have had to go to war with France to become a continental nation, or they would have had to give it up, and native people out in the Trans-Mississippi West probably would have had more of an opportunity to sustain themselves. That makes an interesting issue about, wow, what would the history of the North American continent have been like had that been the case?
Yes, and we normally talk about the Haitian Revolution in half a lecture or a quarter of a lecture. And this shows, these what if sections show that actually we can use it as a case study then to expand and help explain why the Louisiana Purchase happened and also why the French even had such a large piece of land.
Exactly. No, events like that, and I think one way of trying to put a textbook together is seeing how numbers of significant events really ramify in all sorts of directions, and therefore connect up. The Haitian Revolution's about Thomas Jefferson, right? And
Yeah.
his fears about slavery, and it's about, as I said, native people, and it's about different empires. So it could have been about this resurgence of France after their defeat in the 7 Years' War. I mean, there's all sorts of things that come up, and which is why thinking about alternative possibilities that are not far-fetched helps contextualize history and helps us think about change in a larger setting. And there's more actors involved. I mean, if you think about the Haitian Revolution, it turns out that American history was shaped in important ways by enslaved people who were not even in the United States.
Yes, that is amazing. Yeah.
Think about that one. So I remember, for years ago when I started really teaching about the Haitian Revolution, most of my students had never heard about it, or if they heard about it, they didn't know anything about it. And all of a sudden they see that this is really one of the great events of modern history. And it's about the least likely people really being change makers.
Well, let me ask another sort of professorial nerdy question, and that is in a time where people are, well, talking heads and uninformed people are screaming about revisionist history,
Yeah,
and there's
right.
such a thing as the professor watch list. I could imagine that someone taking this approach with these books, what you're really doing is leveling the playing field. You're explaining the continental aspect of all of this. But I could see that there might be pushback or reaction or people saying, oh, wait a minute, this is never going to fly with school boards in the South or whatever. Did any of that kind of thing happen?
Well, the book has just come out, so not yet. I do think that those of us who write for and teach at a college level are probably less vulnerable, depending on where you teach, of course, and depending on the particular institution at which you teach. I think most of the textbooks these days share certain perspectives in common that would be objectionable to a lot of people who feel that this so-called revisionist history is upsetting people and it's making the country look bad, et cetera, and favors certain groups rather than other groups, and diminishes the importance of our founders and so on and so forth. Most of the critiques are not based on any knowledge of reading these things, but based on certain assumptions about what history teaching means. But the point is that history is really at the cutting edge of politics. I mean, there's no question about it. And I've always felt that whoever owns the past owns the present. Whoever's interpretation of how we got to where we are is most persuasive has the best shot at attaining power. If we're talking about making America great again, is an interpretation of American history. You can't think of any major campaign for national power that doesn't have some elements of historical interpretation in it, which makes it really important for students and for everybody to engage with our past and to come to terms with problems as well as things that are to be proud of.
Well, I can imagine that what might happen in theory anyway is that some students in certain regions and certain types of colleges will go home and complain to their parents, and their parents will then complain to the university or the college, and then on and on and on. But what I know for almost certain is that none of those people who then do the complaining will actually bother to go and read this, because if they read the book, they will see how logical, how sensible, how well balanced it is. And they won't, or they shouldn't, lose their minds about what they believe revisionist thinking. It's extremely solid. And as I say, I've completely changed my mind about how I'm going to teach my survey courses from here on. And I'm very grateful that you wrote it the way you did.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. And I wanted to offer up a text that made it possible for students to actually directly engage and to offer history in its many dimensions. And so we worked hard on the visuals, maps, and other images as a way of trying to suggest how the world might have looked like to people who lived in the distant past, and how that vision helps us understand what things that happened and things that didn't happen. The past is very tough, as you know, to get at, and we have to respect the difficulty and the elusiveness of it. One of the things I learned as a graduate student was that you could dig and dig and dig and dig, but at a certain point, you recognize that you could never really know. And all you can do, so that history is always, the whole is more than the sum of its parts. There are always creative leaps. And as you know, we argue with each other about how those leaps are made. But it's also what makes it so exciting, because it's a constant process of discovery. And that discovery is available to people at all levels. You don't need to have a PhD in order to do that.
Well, I happen to think we're in a glory period. There are more academic historians. They're producing more monographs. Because of doing the show, I'm discovering an enormous number of things, and it's just fantastic what's going on. And I want to say to college students out there, not just if you use this book, but any of the recent-ish textbooks, survey textbooks, they have, among other things, these fantastic electronic resources.
Yes, right.
Please just don't take your survey course in this or world history or whatever and just read the textbook and get away. Please delve into the extra stuff that's there. It's great.
Yeah, that's true. Absolutely. And my experience teaching is that students really like history if you bring the excitement that you feel about it into the classroom. And certainly given the fact that so many college students had miserable experiences in high school, oftentimes being taught by athletic coaches who were one chapter ahead of them in a textbook and didn't know anything. At NYU, we give a course called History in the Headline. Every week, a different colleague who is a specialist in a different part of the world comes in and talks about a current event in deep historical context. And the course is packed every semester. And I think it's an indication that young people are really interested in being offered a different and deeper way of thinking about what's going on.
Well, again, it's just a wonderful book, folks. We're going to put it on the Buzzkill bookshelf on the blog post for this episode. And Even if you're not a college student, it is well worth getting, not only because of the text itself, but because of all these ancillary things that are so wonderful. So thank you so much,
Well, thank
Dr.
you so
Hahn.
much. It was really fun to talk.
We hope that you'll come on the show again. And we want to say to all the
Anytime.
Buzzkill.
I
Well,
actually have a
thank
new
you.
book coming out in March. So,
Well, I want to talk to you about that off air in a second because I'm
yes,
hoping to
right.
book you for it.
Right, I know.
So let's say to all the Buzzkillers out there, we will talk to all of you next week.